ask you if you can talk a little bit more about the relationship between embracing complexity and embrace the complex reality of a problem and the need to create a simple, actionable framework that allows teams to work through it.
Okay. So it's a big challenge because particularly in the high-tech industry, but in a lot of industries, decisions are never easy or simple. You're facing complexity and you have to figure out, how do I make a decision that is the best fit for everything that's going on here and all of the different factors that I have to deal with. So what I have seen, too many engineers or engineering managers, because they're so analytical, they struggle with that. They agonize endlessly over, there's all these things that could happen. We better figure out how to deal with them.
Welcome to a new episode of Engines of Creation. I'm your host, Christian Mastrodonato. Stephen Hinch is a veteran of the high-tech industry with over 3 decades of experience, including significant roles at Hewlett, Packard, and Agilent Technologies. In this new episode, we learn many insights from his extensive career and discuss his newly published book, Winning Through Innovation, which explores the intricacies of navigating complexity in the realm of innovation. We delve into the complexity paradox, where Steve highlights the importance of balancing the intricate nature of problems with the need for simple, actionable solutions. He shares practical frameworks for prioritizing issues and making effective decisions in high-pressure environments, emphasizing that a good decision today often outweighs the pursuit of perfection. The conversation also touches on the role of generative AI in modern business, with Steve discussing how AI can assist leaders in sifting through vast amounts of data to identify key insights while recognizing its limitations. He draws parallels between historical shifts in technology, such as the transition from steam to diesel locomotives, and the current landscape influenced by AI, urging companies to remain vigilant and adaptable. Join us for a thought-provoking discussion that provides a valuable lesson on innovation, decision-making, and the evolving role of technology in business. Please don't forget to follow Engines of Creation and leave us a rating and a review. And don't hesitate to share this episode on social media and with friends and colleagues who might be interested. This podcast counts on you to grow and help other people to understand and embrace complexity, to innovate and create. And now, let's go! Welcome, Steve, to the Engines of Creation podcast. I'm really excited to have you here. We had a few guests talking about innovation, but we never actually had a guest who had written a book about innovation. So it's great to have you here today. We're going to learn a lot of interesting things. I would start from asking you to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Okay. Well, thanks, Chris. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. As you said, my name is Steve Hinch. I have spent a long time in the high-tech industry, starting in the late 1970s and still continuing today. Worked 35 years for Hewlett Packard and its spin-off company, Agilent Technologies, in a range of positions, starting in manufacturing engineering, moving to research and development, eventually became the head of a large marketing organization, and then general manager for entire business. So my whole career has been in tech. I did retire from Agilent Technologies maybe 10 and 12 years ago, started my own small business, again, in technology, providing computer support to small businesses. And so I sort of know the multinational corporation side of the business, as well as how to make a business successful when you're only running, you've got 10 people and $2 million a year of revenue. So I've had the whole range of experiences there, which is why I felt like I had insight that I could write a book about innovation that would apply to both sides of the industry there. And so that's what I did. It just came out a couple of months ago.
I think it was a great overview of your career and also what's very interesting in that sense that you poured a lot of your career in this book for what I could read into that. So we're definitely also going to touch upon some of the experience you mentioned, going possibly deeper in your writing. As you probably know, and as our listeners know very well, the core focus of engines of creation is about complexity, and we're really trying to find ways to manage complexity and talking to experts that can help us understand how we can embrace complexity. There is often what we could be called the complexity paradox, because on the one hand, the word is complex, but on the other end, the solution is often, we just need to simplify it, which is not really the thing. You can't really make the word simpler. But there are definitely ways to manage this. And so I think what I really would like to dive into this paradox. And I asked you if you can talk a little bit more about the relationship between embracing complexity and embrace the complex reality of a problem and the need to create a simple, actionable framework that allows teams to work through it.
Okay. So it's a big challenge because particularly in the high-tech industry, but in a lot of industries, decisions are never easy or simple. You're facing complexity and you have to figure out, how do I make a decision that is the best fit for everything that's going on here and all of the different factors that I have to deal with. So what I have seen, too many engineers or engineering managers, because they're so analytical, they struggle with that. They agonize endlessly over, there's all these things that could happen. We better figure out how to deal with them. And they're looking for the perfect decision when in many cases there is no perfect decision. You've got to make the best decision you can and then move on. I like General George Patton said it best: a good decision today is better than the perfect decision next week. So how do you get to that good decision today when it's embedded in complexity? I'll give you a couple of examples. First is, how do you take a complex issue and simplify it down to the few key points? And approach that I have used to simplify things is when we're working on, again, focusing on innovation. How do we get this innovative idea and get it pointed into the right direction in the face of all of these different issues that could divert it in the wrong direction? So I asked the team of innovators to get together and create a list of all of the questions that they can think of that could be concerns for the project. And they're going to come up with a lot of them. And some of them are going to be very important. Some of them are going to be not so important. And some of them are going to be very likely to happen. And some of them are not going to be very likely to happen. And so I asked the team, take that list of 20 or more issues and categorize it, each one of those items into two categories. One is, how likely is it to be that issue is going to happen? And two, how likely or how serious will it be if it does happen? And score each issue in those two categories. So one, score it from 1 to 10 with, how likely is it to happen? 1 being it's probably not going to happen, 10 being it's going to certainly be happening, somewhere in between there. For the seriousness, a 1 means it won't be very serious at all. A 10 means it's going to be a disaster for the whole project. Each category or each issue, then you take those two scores, multiply them together to get a combined score. And what you'll find, ideally, is that all of those 20 issues would fall one above the other or one below the other, and make it easy to say, here are the 3 most important issues that we need to deal with first. That doesn't mean you throw away all the other ones, but you put them at a lower priority. You don't need to solve them right away because you've got fundamental questions that need to be addressed right up front. Now, that's the ideal thing. What'll happen is that, one issue will be scored higher in likelihood and lower in seriousness, and another one will be scored opposite, and so they'll end up with the same combined score. And so what I encourage the team to do then is look at just those 2 issues and score one above the other. And you can't let them both be the same. So, your best insight is this issue more important than the other one. And you'll eventually get this ordered list of priorities that allow you to focus again on the most important things first. And you've got to be diligent about really getting those most important questions answered first. It doesn't make any sense to come up, let's say you're developing a new product, and it doesn't make any sense to come up with a neat new user interface if you don't even know the technology is going to work. Don't waste time coming up with that neat new interface until you've answered the question that the technology works and there's really a market for it. So that's how I encourage people to take complexity and reduce it down. You're not getting rid of it, but you're focusing on the most important areas first. Now, here's another example, and this is sort of different. When I was the general manager of one of the businesses at HP, this was about a $100 million a year business. HP was a mini multi-billion dollar a year company at the time, and we were going through the whole industry was going through a financial decline, the Great Recession kind of thing, and the general manager, the CEO of the company, decided the only way that we were going to get through this downturn in the economy is to make major cuts in our expenses. And he made a proclamation, a very simple proclamation: no more travel, cut travel out. Until we get through this, you're not allowed to travel anywhere. So I was the general manager of a business that did a lot of business in Japan. And not long after we got that message, we heard back from several customers in Japan that were very unhappy with the product that we had recently introduced. They weren't getting it to do what they wanted to. Now, with the Japanese customers, relationships are very important. And I did not think that this was something that we could solve just over the phone or by email. So I decided I would send my top engineer over to Japan, even in the face of this travel freeze. If we didn't have a travel freeze, I would have probably sent that engineer plus a marketing person, but I cut it down to just one person. He went over there, quickly solved the problem that those companies were having because they didn't understand how to use the product right. And he came back, and the problem was solved. A couple of weeks later, after he came back, the company CEO came around and visited, and he stopped by my desk to see how things were going. And I apologized to him for the fact that I had sent an engineer over to Japan in the face of this travel freeze, but I felt it was necessary to protect $10 million a year of business. And he said, "Steve, you don't have to apologize. I have to make grand pronouncements because the board would have my neck if they didn't see that expenses had dropped tremendously. But I expect my senior managers to be smart enough to know what to do to do the right thing for their business." So that's an example of where this could have been a very complex situation, and I reduced it down to this is what we need to do. It was the right answer. So those are a couple of examples of how you can deal with complexity and hopefully end up with approaches that work.
I love these examples, and definitely it is one of the core features and standout features of your book that is all based on these practical examples. And it's interesting, these two examples are related to risk management, a risk-first approach, and to mission command versus a command and control culture, because that is all things that came up several times with different guests in this podcast.
And I do have to say, I knew my general or my CEO well enough to know that he wouldn't fire me for sending somebody over to Japan. Other CEOs could have fired me, and you have to understand your business situation before you make a decision like that.
Absolutely. I think you knew the company culture. You knew the culture that he was trying to set. And there is an element of, on the one hand, to provide the right direction, which is we need to reduce trouble, versus the actual specific situation of the mission that you knew he didn't, and you had the delegation and the empowerment to make the call, which was your job. It wasn't the CEO job. You didn't know the details of the customers that you knew. And I think that's where you want to create that level, cascading that level of empowerment at the right levels of the organization to make these calls. And I think it's a very good point, because culture is key in being able, knowing, am I doing the right call? Am I allowed to do that? Versus if I do it, I am fired. That's a super important point. I'm thinking also, extending a bit, I would like to get some other elements of wisdom, because you mentioned these two key elements on managing complexity. Another element which I constantly see in complex problems, let's say around innovation, of course, but I would say nowadays it's everywhere, in the sense that if you don't constantly innovate in industry, sort of your business is going to die quite quickly. And one of the issues constantly see is that, of course, there is a constant flow of information. Any project, product development where you are involved, there is so much to process. And so the question is, how do a leader can sift through all this information and identify the signal inside all this noise? Because a lot of things are not important.
So things are changing there rapidly today because of the new technology called AI, generative AI. I don't have all of the answers for this yet because it's still evolving, but AI can really help managers analyze large amounts of data that need to be simplified and distilled out what the important things are versus what the unimportant things are. So, there are tons of financial data that you might need to analyze that would take you forever, but you can have AI analyze hundreds of pages of financial results and give you summaries of them very quickly. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there that isn't fully being taken advantage of yet, but it's over the next year or two, I think it's going to become a lot more important. Now, do you have to be the one to invent the AI tool to help you do the analysis? No, I don't think so. There will be more commercial tools available that can help. There already are commercial tools available. In the healthcare industry, radiologists can look at X-rays and decide whether there's a tumor there, and they may be right 50 or 60% of the time. AI can compare that X-ray to hundreds of thousands of X-rays that it's storing in its data that it already knows the answers to, and say, yep, this looks like it's a cancer tumor, or this doesn't look like a cancer tumor. So those are the kind of things that can help you reduce complexity, and we'll have to see how it evolves over the next couple of years to provide managers, especially, tools that can be commercially available that help them do that analysis.
That's a great point, actually. Yeah, because as the tools are evolving so quickly that, what worked yesterday probably it's old today, and there are going to be new tools next year. Now let's move on, and we definitely talk about sort of the frameworks and the right way on which we can approach complexity. Maybe also I'm thinking specifically to the example you gave about your executive on sending the engineer to Japan. And the focus here is about execution. You state in your book that flawed execution has doomed many more companies than lack of innovative ideas. And that made me think about an old adage of having new ideas is easy, the execution it is difficult. And so I think there is some truth in there. And so I think, how can you manage, on the one hand, kind of keeping a steady ship and keeping a clear vision, a bit like there was the vision of the we need to save travel costs versus the day-to-day decisions. How can you balance that out in a way that is efficient and effective?
So I may not answer that question exactly, but let's talk about it in terms of innovation, which is where my expertise is. And I'm going to start by giving you my definition of innovation in the business world. There's other kinds of innovations. I'm not going to tell you how to innovate in the music industry or how in art, but in the business world, my definition of innovation, it consists of two parts. Innovation is the ability to see the opportunity in places that others do not see it, and be able to turn that vision into profitable reality. So there's two parts of it: the innovative idea and being able to execute to actually make it profitable. Lots of people have great ideas and they never go anywhere because they don't know how to turn those into something real. And I've dealt with a number of engineers who people will say are very creative. They're always coming up with neat, innovative ideas, but they never go anywhere because there's no way to turn those innovative ideas into reality. So the real value is in an organization that can go from the innovative idea to deliver the final result that actually brings revenue and profit into the company. There are different ways to do that because there are different kinds of innovation. But one of the key things that you always want to make sure is that the people who are doing the innovation understand what the company is all about. What are the objectives of this company? Because if you don't know what your company is trying to do, you're not going to know how to innovate. And I've seen too many lower level, first level engineers and production workers. They just focus on getting done what they're doing right now today. And they don't really think about how this plays into the overall vision of what the company is trying to do. Innovation really depends on you knowing what that company is all about so that you can put your thoughts into the right areas. I mean, it's not going to do you any good to come up with a neat, innovative idea for how to select the menu items in the company cafeteria if you're not in the business of running cafeterias. So don't spend time innovating in areas that don't make any sense. And I've certainly seen that. And you've got to sort of balance that because the disruptive innovation ideas may not align exactly with the business that you're in today, but they're still going to have some relationship to it. So you need to focus on the right kind of innovation, and you need to give people time to innovate, particularly people that are responsible for delivering results every month and every quarter and every week. This manager's got a report to be done, turned into his boss by Friday. He's not going to want to take time out to think about innovative ideas because he's got this deliverable he's got to do by Friday. So what I've always tried to do is give my team a specific expectation that I want you to spend 2 hours per week on average where you're outside of your normal business responsibility, just thinking about innovation. And you're not probably going to do that on your own. You're going to get a small team together and you guys are going to kick around innovative ideas. And what I've found is that some of the best innovative ideas come about when people are standing around the coffee pot at break time talking, or they're sitting together at lunch in the company cafeteria. They are not being distracted by all the, people aren't coming over to them in the cafeteria and saying, hey, I got to figure this problem out right now. So they have time to innovate. And if they're not doing that in that kind of environment, you probably need to get them out of the company environment, go to a coffee shop or something. And this is different nowadays with so many people working from home or in a hybrid environment. That we won't talk about how to deal with that now, but that certainly adds complexity to innovation. But those are some of the thoughts I have about how you can take innovation from an idea to something that actually is deliverable. Because there's a lot of things that you have to think about besides, here's the innovative idea, okay, but is there a market for it? And what about the competition? What are they doing? How do you make sure that the competition doesn't get there before you do and make your innovative idea no longer relevant? So all of that stuff is stuff that you need to put into the total process for coming up with an innovation. It's not just, here's this bright idea, but here are all the things that we need to do to make it profitable.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, it's very important that there is this understanding somehow of, you can come up with anything, but then, how do you put it to the ground? Staying on innovation, there is another thing that, let's say, bothers me, which is often we tend to confuse the map with the territory. It's something that happens to any human being, and it happens a lot when you see that also in business and corporate environments. And actually, there was this saying from this statistician, George Box, that used to say, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I think that's the point where sometimes when we have models, when we have maps, in the sense they are simplifying reality, but they can be helpful. What I found interesting in your book is that you brought some models and some frameworks. You have the 4 type of innovation. I think there are also the 4 market phases. How do you make sure you can use this model to help on your work without oversimplifying things? What I mean with that could be like, okay, actually, you propose 4 types of innovation, but we might end up into a specific situation where the kind of innovation we're working on might be a combination of 2 of the 4, something like that. But sometimes I found situations in company where they'll say, that's the framework, it must be one of the 4. There is no option in the middle.
So it's a good question, and I can give you some insight into it that may or may not fit your vision, but let's talk about it, because the idea of, the 4 types of innovation, other authors talk about more than a dozen types of innovation. And you need to separate out what your objective is and when you're trying to actually innovate and do the actual innovative ideas, knowing those 14 different types of innovation can help you because, like you say, it might not fit naturally, ideally into one of those 4 quadrants that I map out there. But my point in having those 4 quadrants is not so much for you to oversimplify the idea of innovation. It's how do you get that message out to people that you need to be supporting you? And if you go, and I see this, so this actually happened once where an engineer that I worked with went to the senior leadership in our organization with a great idea, and she framed it in terms of the 14 types of innovation and went through a complex description. The senior leadership guys their eyes were glazed over after just a couple of minutes because they didn't want to go into that level of detail. And if she had understand what the audience needed, she could have taken what is a complex, when you're working on it, it's going to be complex. But when you're trying to get support from your leaders, you want to make it simple enough for them to understand. So putting it into one of those 4 quadrants is something they could relate to. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to simplify what you're actually doing. It's really more of a message to the people that you need to get support. And some of these are going to be the senior leaders of your organization. Some of them are going to be the people that you need to get help from. If you can communicate it in a way that they can say, oh, yeah, I understand what you're doing there, even though that's an overly simplified explanation, that's what it takes to get the support you need to be able to be successful in your innovation.
I like that. I like the focus on the communication side and using these tools where they're needed more to explain to others, but at the right level, understanding the audience and putting yourself in their shoes and understand what's the objective as you started. Okay, now shifting away, trying to cover another element of your book that I found interesting. And in particular, you bring the story of steam engines versus diesel. Well, you also mentioned earlier about generative AI. And so we have been in the past in front of these transformative technologies. And not is that the people in the past were dumb in any way, but it's not easy sometimes to see what's coming your way because you might be too busy actually fixing the today problem versus actually looking on, okay, what's the landscape, what's the trajectory, and what we're trying to do. But I think what I'm trying to get from you is what do these historical examples teach us about facing this changing? And again, everyone feels like we're kind of in the middle of one of those with generative AI. So what can we learn from these historical examples that we can apply today?
Great question. And let me talk about the locomotive industry transition from steam to diesel as a good example of what happened in the past that is very applicable today. And let me just start by saying that up until around 1950, the railroad industry was driven by steam locomotives. Not a single steam locomotive was sold after 1949. Every locomotive from then forward was diesel, and not a single manufacturer of steam locomotives survived that transition because they were all busy trying to make better steam locomotives when the world had already moved to diesel, and it was less expensive, didn't need as much support. So what happened, and could the steam manufacturers have looked at what was going on and dealt with this better? And I'll give you an example later of something where it has worked. But there were plenty of messages or plenty of things that were happening decades before 1949 that if the steam locomotive manufacturers had paid attention to them, they would have known technology is changing. We'd better try to be advanced. The first change was back in the 1890s when cities didn't want steam locomotives going through their cities anymore. So they transitioned to electric streetcars. None of the steam locomotive manufacturers made streetcars. General Electric was one of the first manufacturers there. But steam locomotive manufacturers didn't pay attention to that. Okay, we don't have to worry about those small locomotives anymore. We'll focus on our core business. And there were other events. The next one was what are called rail cars, were basically streetcars with their own internal gas engine, so you didn't need a long cable of electricity that they needed to use a cable to power from. All of these indications, there were warning signs all along the way that the steam locomotive manufacturers ignored. And that didn't mean that they didn't do anything there. They did do some work on diesel locomotives, but it was only because they felt they had to, and they didn't really put the right level of attention into it. And so they were never successful at it. Being able to see what's happening in the industry, and early warning signs are always there that tell you that things are going to change. Let me give you an example of another company that I think has been reasonably successful at that. 20 years ago, T&T was the provider of most of your landline telephones stuff. And if they had said, we're going to continue to focus on landline telephones, they would be obsolete today. But they recognized that mobile phones were the wave of the future, and they set up an entirely separate organization, AT&T Mobile, to deal with that evolving technology. The part of AT&T that still provided landline technology didn't want to have anything to do with mobile. They were still focusing on being more successful there. But AT&T as a company recognized the importance of this evolving technology and set things up to be successful. There are tons of examples of companies that didn't do that and are no longer relevant. So it's just sort of an example of you've got to pay attention to evolving trends in the industry, even things that you don't think are going to impact you right now, but you need to have contingency plans for how to deal with them. And that's what some companies are better able to do than others.
Yeah, I understand. And I think it's very relevant, especially nowadays. And which kind of leads easily to the next question, which is focusing more on generative AI, as you alluded earlier, also as a new tool that we can use. Well, definitely it feels like something that is going to disrupt us and change the reality for a lot of companies. I would say a lot of, especially data and desk-based companies, we can probably see with robotics and other things going in that direction also for other more manufacturing-based. But let's just focus on the generative AI example right now, because that's where many companies are facing. So how can today's company can apply the methods that they can learn from your book into just facing this specific problem of keep innovating in the face of generative AI, while on the other end, we have to look at the bottom line, we have to look at sort of maintaining also our revenues with the current product line. So what are the core elements for that?
So the first thing you need to understand is what AI is good at and what it is not good at. AI is really good at analyzing data that it has to extract information out of it. It is not as good at drawing conclusions from that data that don't directly apply to that data. And let me give you I'm going to give you an analogy. It's not a perfect analogy, but I think it gets across sort of the key concepts behind AI. And so I want you to sort of put your thought processes on and imagine that you were a person that had photographic memory. You could remember every detail of everything you've ever read. And your friends know that. And so whenever they have a question that they don't have the answer to, they come to you and ask you for the answer. And one day, one of your friends comes to you and she says, I'm working on a term paper for my college that is focused on the economy of South America in the 1950s. And I'd like to know what the GDP of the country of Bolivia was in 1953. Can you tell me that? Well, you rummage through your mind and you never read anything that gives you that exact answer, but you did read some things that could be useful. There was a World Bank report that said the total economy in South America in 1950 was $35 billion. And by 1955, it had grown to $50 billion. And you've also read a Wikipedia entry that said the country of Bolivia was one of the poorest South American countries, and they contributed less than 2% to the total South American economy. So you take that information that you know and run it through your mind and come up with a calculation that says, GDP of Bolivia in 1953, I'm going to say, was $641 million. Now, there's several problems with that. One is it's such an exact answer, people are going to think it's real, but it's just an estimate based on data that may or may not be particularly relevant. Second, you can't be sure that everything in your database is accurate. I mean, who wrote that Wikipedia article? Where did they get their data from? And did they have any animosity against Bolivia when they wrote it? So you can only base your calculation on the data that you've got. And the other thing is that you may not be the only person in the world with a photographic memory. And if you go to ask that same question to somebody else who has read different stuff, they will give you a different answer. So that's sort of the challenge with AI today. And technology is being focused in two areas to improve AI. One is, how do we make the data in our databases, the large language models, how do we make that more accurate? Get rid of the bad data and put more good data into it. Second is, how do we improve the algorithms that we are using to analyze that data to come up with better answers? And that's what generative AI is evolving to. Agentic AI, which is evolving to something else I can't remember right now. But those are all trying to focus on improving the algorithms that you use to extract useful information from that data. AI is still limited. It's going to only tell you answers from within what it knows. And I can give you an example. I wanted to see what ChatGPT would do. So I asked it to tell me, give me an answer. I want to come up with a technology to replace commercial jet aircraft that can get people transported from one city to another twice as fast and at half the cost of commercial airliners today. And so ChatGPT came back and said, I've got two answers for you. One is Elon Musk has been working on something called a hyperloop, which will allow you to send people basically through the modern equivalent of the old mailing tube from LA to San Francisco very rapidly and at a very low cost. And the other thing is that there are some companies working on suborbital transport to get you from LA to London in half the time. It may not be any less expensive, but it gets people there faster. The problem with both of those is AI didn't invent either of those. It's basically telling you things that are already working on. If it hadn't read anything about Hyperloop transport, it would have not been able to invent it itself. And put this in perspective a little bit more. You and I, any individual person, consumes about 2,000, 2,500 calories a day. That's about 100 watts of power. If you asked AI to come up with innovative ideas, but you can only use 100 watts of power to do that, you won't get anything. AI needs kilowatts, megawatts, gigawatts of power to be successful. And even then, it can only give you answers from within it, what it knows. If you take 10 smart people, put them together in a room and ask them to innovate, you're generating 1,000 watts of power, and they will be able to come up with that Hyperloop idea that generative AI will never be able to do. Generative AI can be very helpful for you, though, because it can tell you, I can estimate that if you were able to do this, we can probably get about 20 million people per year to be interested in it. And it can tell you that, 80% of the people that will be interested weigh less than 200 pounds and are less than 6 feet tall. And that's all very important information that will help you innovate, but it's not going to be the way that you come up with the innovative answer itself. So AI can be very helpful if you understand the limitations of what it can do, which is basically extract insight from the data that it has, and then it gives you information that you can use then to do the innovative idea.
Thank you. There would be a lot more to talk about that and dive into, but I think it is a very helpful overview of the right approaches. And it touches also, I'm thinking in particular of an older episode with Gianni Giacomelli from MIT. His focus was on collective intelligence, but there is an element of, AI is going to be part of this collective intelligence where we're going to have humans and AI agents, and they will contribute, as you said, analyzing information. They don't necessarily need to be the final decision makers, though, but it's more about exactly how do we embed this intelligence into our workflows and ways of working. That it's going to be the key differentiator. I think that was a great overview, and I would advise everyone, if this conversation wasn't enough to convince them, to look at your book, Winning Through Innovation. All the examples you gave us, and there are many others, of course, can be very relevant to look at these problems and trying to stay competitive in these days where, as I said earlier, if you don't innovate, you're basically out of business,
That's right.
whatever business you are. But so that leads to the final question. Thinking, of course, also from your perspective, all your career, case studies you provided in your book, and all your experience. So what are for you the characteristics of a leader who embraces complexity?
So the key point there is that a leader needs to be a motivator of people. The leader shouldn't be the one that is doing all of the inventive work, but they should be creating an environment that makes their team be able to be successful. And you don't need the smartest engineer to be leading an engineering team. They need to know something about engineering and enough to give the engineers that are being led confidence that they know what they're doing. Get the team, develop the team so that they can be as productive as possible. And you're not going to be doing that if you're having to make all the decisions and you're forcing everybody to run every decision through you. Coach your team to develop them to be successful. That means that occasionally they're going to make errors. You need to be okay with that. And you make errors too. So admit the fact that you're not perfect. They may make decisions that are different from what you would have done, but you need to give them the flexibility to try things out and learn from the decisions that they make. So that idea of a leader leading as opposed to managing, which is where you're doing all of it yourself, that's especially true. And it's especially true for small companies where you might have an owner with 10 people and the owner feels like he has to make every decision himself. As long as you're doing that, you're never going to grow from $2 million a year to $20 million a year. You've got to be able to grow your team and count on their knowledge to be able to help you make the right decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it also touches back to some of the initial examples that you gave us. And we covered a lot of ground. And I think we covered centuries from steam engines to generative AI. Just thank you very much, Steve, for being here today with us. And again, as a reminder for everyone, Steve's book has just been published, Winning Through Innovation.
Thank you, Chris. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.